Good morning, everybody. We've got dinner. Good morning and welcome to everybody. I hope you are well. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Peatlands Gathering 2021. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping, just for those of you who didn't join us yesterday. So just to say that the event is on a webinar format, and we will be recording, and you'll be able to access those sessions again in the future if you have to step out. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box and our team will direct it to the chairs of each of the sessions. We will run to program. Hopefully we won't have any technical glitches, but please bear with us as we navigate through this wonderful world of Zoom. In between sessions, we will be doing some technical checks, so don't be surprised if you see a bit of ongoing activity or chat between the sessions. And I just want to say again, 1,000 thanks to all our sponsors and our organizing team and all our supporters. This event would not be possible without any of you. So just a couple of reflections on yesterday. We heard a lot yesterday, and I have to say I was absolutely exhausted last night and just fit to lie down and put my feet up. Today we're going to hear a lot more. So this morning we have 3 sessions. The afternoon then is for reflection and discussion. And I suppose while we're still fresh in the morning, I want to just remind us all that this is just the beginning. And after the end of the conference today, or the gathering, we take our learnings with us and we bring them to our own work, to our own communities. Yesterday we had 5 sessions packed with lots of science and lots of culture. Some key words really stood out for me: community, collaboration, connection, culture, carbon, climate, condition or lack thereof, water flows and challenges, understanding, data gaps, and mutual co-benefits. But I really got the sense that everyone was working for peatlands and wanted to work together. But as I woke up this morning, I was reminded that, you know, lest we walk forward with doughy-eyed mysticism, peatlands are political. They are contested landscapes. And at least one good minister has lost his seat, or he might have fell on the sword, as it were, over the conservation of raised bogs. And that's because livelihoods, vested interests, jobs, economy, all of these things are at stake. And that's our challenge, to work towards a common goal, towards sustainable livelihoods and a just transition, as Seamus Boland said yesterday, that no one gets left behind. So that people's values and beliefs are treated with respect, and change is frightening, but it is also essential. Values and beliefs can change. We don't throw kings in the bog, for example, when the crops fail. They just lose their seat in the Dáil, or maybe they lose their jobs. It's not an easy path working together. And I know I've spent a lot of time defending views and fighting to save bits of bog. So let's keep that in mind as we navigate through today. And I want to welcome our keynote this morning. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Matthijs Schouten. Matthijs was born a couple of decades ago. He studied biology and comparative religion at the University of Wageningen and Celtic Studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He's worked as a lecturer and as an ecological project leader for the Wildlife Service in Dublin. He was leader of the international campaign for the conservation of Irish bogs, and he might be called the godfather of Irish bogs. Since 1992, he is Senior Ecological Officer at the National Forest Service of the Netherlands. Since 1995, he's been a visiting professor of nature and landscape conservation at UCC and UCG here in Ireland. And in 1999, he accepted the chair of restoration ecology at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. In 1990, I don't know where he gets the time, he was awarded the International Award for Conservation Merit by the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and in 1992, the National University of Ireland granted him a well-deserved honorary doctorate. He has published widely in the fields of ecology and nature philosophy, and his latest book is Nature's Mirror, the Image of Nature in a Cultural Perspective. That's the basis of an exhibition for World Nature Art in Amsterdam, and an absolute pleasure, Matthijs. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to be here, and I have to tell you, I'm just back from Ireland, where I revisited 14 bog sites that I studied 40 years ago, together with a PhD student who's going to redo my research to see whether climate change has impacted upon bogs in Ireland. And two things stuck out for me in my experience in this trip down memory lane. It was basically, one is that I've grown old because my PhD student who's 24 was much better in bog trotting than I am now. But secondly, of the 14 sites I visited, 2 are gone. One has been cut away, and the other one has been in part planted with conifers, but 12 were still there. And not only were they still there, they're conserved. They're either now parts of a national park, or they are SACs or NHAs. So I came back quite happy, I must say, seeing that sites that some of them I hadn't seen for 40 years, were still there. I studied them between 1978 and 1982 as a PhD student. And part of my story will be a comparison between what has been happening in the Netherlands and what has happened in Ireland and is happening in Ireland. So I first have to give the context from where I came from when I was a PhD student in the 70s and 80s of the last century. I came from a country which once had, as a percentage of land area, more bog than Ireland has ever had. At the beginning of our era, more than 50% of the Netherlands were under bog. That changed dramatically in the next 2,000 years, partly through sea incursions, which wiped away a lot of our bogs, but also through peatland exploitation, because in the Netherlands, bog exploitation started in the Middle Ages and then grew in scale from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards. And you have to realize that the whole wealth of Amsterdam in the 17th and 18th centuries was based on cheap fuel. The result of all this was that in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, we had only 10,000 hectares of cut over bog left, drained, dried, and cut over. And in the 60s and 70s of last century, we started to realize that we'd lost an important part of our national heritage. And bog restoration programs started in the late 60s and the early 70s. And when I was a PhD student, we had already spent about 10 million guilders in those days on bog restoration and bog rehabilitation projects. And they were beginning to show some effects and some successes, but that was still in a very early stage. Now, I was very interested in bog ecology, and my then professor of botany at Nijmegen University said, then you should go to Ireland. There are loads of bogs and they haven't been studied very intensively yet. And the idea was that I would be studying the change of vegetation when you travel from the east of the country to the west of the country, from lowlands to uplands. And I asked my professor, where do I find these bogs? And he said, you just stop your car and there's always a bog nearby. Now, that wasn't the case, because when I started my work, I tried to find intact sites in a transect across the country, and that took quite some time to find some 15 sites that were reasonably intact to study. And when I came back the second year, I started in 78, and I came back in 79, 2 of them had machines on them that were draining the bogs. And the year after, again, 2 were affected. So I got slightly worried, and then visited people in the Wildlife Service, amongst others, Jim Ryan, and talked about the state of Irish bogs. And he shared my concern, but said, we have limited resources, we have a limited amount of people working in Wildlife Service. Moreover, the Irish people see bogs as wasteland. So it would be very difficult to get a bog conservation program going in Ireland. So if you really want to do something, you have to start an international campaign. And that's what we did. We started in '82. We set up a foundation in the Netherlands for bog conservation in Ireland. And I have to tell you, that was reasonably successful, because within 4 years, we raised more than 1 million guilders for bog conservation in Ireland. Because the Dutch were fascinated by Irish bogs, simply because we had lost our bogs. One of the first things we did is we asked Dutch artists to donate work for Irish bog conservation. And I was amazed by the fact that a big number of quite prominent Dutch artists said, all right, I'm in, fascinating. And we sold in an exhibition that lasted for a week, more than 40 works and raised more than 200,000 guilders. So we were successful. And after 4 years, we were able to purchase 3 sites that we handed over as a Dutch nation to the Irish nation as nature reserves. That happened at a big event that we organized in the Netherlands in 1987. And the then Minister of State, Noel Tracy, who was there, then declared that he would set up a bog conservation program, and that at least 40,000 hectares of bog should be conserved in Ireland. Shortly after, our Dutch Queen visited Roundstone Bog, and I can tell you, whenever I meet the Queen, who's now retired, by the way, the first question she always asks is, what is the situation with the Irish bogs? So they're probably there in our Dutch psyche, the Irish bogs. Since the 80s of the last century, a lot has changed and happened. First of all, of course, there is a European legislation which has led to the conservation of a big number of sites under the European Habitats Directive, but also there has been a change in attitude in Ireland. And I noticed that again on my trip a few weeks ago. You know, when I started this campaign, my nickname became the Dutch Weirdo. And for quite a number of years, I was a Dutch weirdo. And things started to change when in the 90s, I read a short article, I think it was in a paper from Tipperary, where the journalist described how itinerants had traveled to a small village where they usually camped, and they were on the way to their bog campsite because they were always sent to the bog. And then the local villagers had stopped them and said, no, 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 you cannot go to the bog because that's national heritage. And I felt something is changing in the psyche in Ireland. And I was much surprised 3 weeks ago when I was in Clara Bog, which was a very contested site in the 80s. And after a big international battle that we fought, was conserved and handed over by Bord na Móna, or sold by Bord na Móna to the state as a nature reserve. At that stage, there was a lot of opposition in the local village, Clara, because people felt that that was a loss of jobs, etc., etc. Now there's a boardwalk in Clara Bog, and I had a Dutch film crew with me who were making a film on bog. Because there were so many people walking there with prams and doing their morning exercises and making photographs. So something has changed also in the Irish psyche over the last 40 years. And one could say that bogs have changed in image from wasteland, and I'm losing my video, from wasteland to the host has stopped it, okay. From wasteland to a national treasure. Let's then return to the Netherlands, where we started bog rehabilitation programs in the 70s. We have now spent over 30 million euros on bog rehabilitation in the 10,000 hectares of cutaway that we have left. I was involved 5 years ago in a research project in which we were trying to establish how successful that program of rehabilitation has been. And what we were ordered to do is to exactly determine how many hectares of functioning acrothelm has returned in our Irish bog sites. That means how many hectares of actively growing peat mosses we now have in sites under restoration. Now, I can give you the figure of 5 years ago. That's exactly 23 hectares. Again, 10,000 hectares of bog under restoration It has cost us 30 million euros. And we have now 23, or we had 23 hectares. I can start again, I see. Okay. We had 5 years ago 23 hectares of active agrotap. Now, that work was redone 5 months ago, and the figure is now 18 hectares. There has been a decrease, and a decrease is in all likelihood associated with the change in climate, because we had a number of extremely dry summers over the last 4 years. The point is, it's extremely important to maintain what you've left. We have found in the Netherlands that rehabilitation and restoration of peatlands is extremely costly and not always successful. And in light of climate change, the chances of good rehabilitation are diminishing, because we now find that with all our investments, with the changing climate and the drier summers, some of our bog sites may not deliver what we hoped through the restoration programs. That's one thing that I want to give you. Maintain what you still have. Try to conserve what's still reasonably intact. But there's another important new issue in all of this, because we conserved bogs in the 70s and 80s and 90s primarily for ecological reasons, because of ecology, because of rare species, etc., etc. But in the past decades, bogs have gained an additional significance. They are now a crucial player in the whole climate change problem because of carbon sequestration. And I think what's extremely important at the moment that we need to address certain questions that we were not discussing 40 years ago in light of climate change. First of all, there's the question, how does climate change affect peatlands? We in the Netherlands are not so sure about the survival of our bogs in the future, because we are affected by climate change, and all calculations indicate that we will get much drier summers. So we don't even know whether even bogs that have been partly rehabilitated will survive in the future. For Ireland, as I said, I revisited the sites that I studied in the 70s and 80s of last century. And my preliminary impression is that the mountain bogs are exactly the same as they were 40 years ago. I was initially in Blue Mountains, and that is exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. The western blanket bogs also looked rather similar. And we could even because I mapped vegetation patterns in the 70s and 80s, and my student had a drone and he could exactly locate the maps of that I made 40 years ago, and they looked very much the same. In the raised bogs in the east, the situation is different. They were drier than I remembered them, and also our maps of the 70s and 80s compared to what there is now also shows that these bogs have become drier. We don't know whether that is because of climate or because of all kinds of effects of human activities that have taken place in the past in the bogs, because some of these bogs are still affected by marginal drainage, and there is still peat subsidence, etc., etc. So that's one of the things that my PhD student is going to address. But it is
2 minutes remaining there, Matthijs. Thank you.
It's crucial that we try to see how climate change impacts on bogs. The other crucial question I think that we need to answer is what to do with cutaways. Traditionally, there has always been the discussion, either we use them for agriculture or for forestry, or we rehabilitate them and re-wet them, etc., etc. I think in the light of climate change, that discussion needs to be restarted and readdressed, because in the Netherlands, half of our country is cutaway bog that has been used for agriculture. One of our most important political discussions at the moment is that from these past cutaway bogs that are now under agriculture, there's a lot of carbon emission. So a lot of people feel that we need to re-wet these areas, and that creates a conflict with agriculture. That's one of the hottest political discussions at the moment, because that concerns about 40% of our nation. So that whole traditional discussion, how to use cutaways, either for agriculture, forestry, or for rehabilitation, I think needs to be readdressed. And one of the crucial questions I feel now for the near future is, how can we best use cutaways or make use of cutaways in terms of carbon sequestration to counteract climate change? And that is, for me, one of the most critical questions that Ireland needs to address in the near future. And I think I'm exactly within my time now. Am I not?
I think
perfect.
Yeah, I think
okay, that was it.
I think it's thank you. Apologies for your camera switching off, so that's a slight technical glitch. And
okay.
but I think we were all struck at that moment when you talked about 23 hectares of raised bog and now 18 hectares. And it really shows, how much money we pour into these areas. We need to manage our expectations, but at the same time, we still have to look after these areas because of their massive carbon banks, their reserves. There are places that if that carbon is to be released, it's just going to add to our climate problems. And that message about maintaining what we still have. And, yesterday we heard about John Connolly, who has mapped the peatlands, outlined that, in the order of maybe between 400,000 and 500,000 hectares of peatland under grassland. We'll be having some discussions about that later this afternoon. We'll be hearing from Gary Lanigan talking about the emissions from farmland, and Philip Blackwell from the department. So, and the Farm Peat project, Matthijs, is actually, you know yourself, Paddy Crushel and Lawler are working on this. So it's very much on the agenda. I'm going to give you an opportunity to say one more thing, just in case you're reflecting over what you said, and then we're going to move into the session one, and if you can stay around and listen, and we can have our Q&A at the end of that. How does that sound? Is there one thing you'd like to say, that you didn't say?
That your situation is so much better than ours in the Netherlands. When I talked about the 23 hectares of aquatalm restored that we had 5 years ago, which is now I think 18, that was on completely drained cutaway sites that were as dry as a bone, and that we then tried to rehabilitate. A number of reasonably intact sites left in terms of raised bogs, but also blanket bogs in Ireland. But even your damaged sites are in a much better situation than what we have left in the Netherlands. So your options for restoring peatland sites that have been damaged to a certain degree are much, much, much better than ours. So I always see Ireland as the treasure house of bogs in Western Europe with great opportunities. So I'm quite hopeful. That's my last message. And especially after my visit 2 weeks ago, I'm rejuvenated.
I can see that. And in the spirit of that hope and rejuvenation, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Shane McGuinness, who's going to bring us through the first session. And if you can stay with us, Matthijs, for an hour or so, that would be fantastic.
Okay.